Very good morning to all of you. So we wish to start at 9:05. So right time for us to start. So today we have two panels. This is the first panel for today, and then the title of the panel is Panel 5, Citizenship and Human Movement in and After the Conflict. So on the brochure, this version, we have just three speakers, but actually we have 4 speakers, as you can see on this supplementary sheet. So we wish to invite 4 speakers. Okay. So without too much of lengthy introduction, I simply wish to invite 4 speakers one by one, and then each of the speakers has 15 minutes for the initial presentation, please. And then followed by the initial full presentation, we'd like to invite the discussant. Okay? So and then Dr. Aiko Nishida, she will be starting as discussant for all of his presentation. Thank you so much. So first, let me invite Dr. Mariana Maximovich of Institute of Social Sciences, and then her presentation topic is Globalization, Migrants, and Social Conflict, Consequences for Serbia. So please, thank you very much.
Globalization begins. There's caused a number of increase of inequality, the enlargement of the European Union, reduction of the number of population, many conflicts, economic crisis, and migration. Globalization of the world economy, followed by many crises, the most significant of them in the 2008 economic crisis, accompanied by the expansion of information and other technologies, knowledge, increasing difference in wealth, increasing migration. The total number of migrants in the world does not exceed 3% of the world population. Migrants are citizens who are not born in the country where they live. Migrants are the winners of globalization. There are inequalities in income distribution among states, but they are not decisive for the position of an individual in the distribution of global income. On the basis of this, migrants can improve their status of position. However, even the question of the age of the population is no more optimistic. The oldest people in the world are Japanese and Germans. They are 46 old years, followed by Italy, Austria, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand. A high degree of economic development, people's focus on consumerism towards individualism, effect of low birth rate. The youngest inhabitants of the world are from nature, 15 old years, followed by Uganda and please. Countries with old population are not subject to unrest, but they have a labor shortage problem. States with a predominantly young population are subject to civil unrest and dissatisfaction, and the reason is the inability of the economy to absorb all resilience in the labor market. For example, there are 2 billion people between 15 and 24 old years on the planet. They live mainly in countries where there is no hope, especially since 2008. The oldest population in the Europe is in Germany, 46.1 all years. The youngest population is Albania, 31.6 all years. There is a decline in the number of inhabitants, but it is replaced by the influx of migrants from Africa, from the Middle East. The number of migrants worldwide in the total population in the period 2000-2015 increased by 41%. The issue of birth rate of European countries, Ireland has the highest birth rate of 16.5 and Italy the smallest 7.6. During the migration crisis of 2015, 1 million migrants come to Europe. There are 8 migrants routes to the European Union: West African, Western Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, route Apulian, Calabria, the circular route from Albania to Greece, the Western Balkan route, East Mediterranean route at the eastern border. Europe has become a continent of immigrations, even though in the past it was the continent of emigration. People from Europe used to immigrate to America, Canada, and Australia. Now migrants come from to the near and far past, but also from south and southeast. The question is, are migrants going to European countries because of good jobs or welfare states? However, the golden age of the welfare states has passed. There are 3 models of welfare states in Europe: Anglo-Saxon, continental, and Nordic type of social states. The most Nordic type is because the benefits are the highest. This. The rights of the citizens, protect jobs and protect taxpayers. What are the motives and causes of migration? Search for a better life, economic prosperity, wars, climate change, mass poverty. Migration is often accompanied by difficult assimilation as well as cultural, existential obstacles that make life difficult in one environment. This is also indicated by increasingly frequent conflict between migrants and the local population, insecurity, and the inability of Europe to mitigate or systematically resolve this. The policy of multiculturalism has been cracked, according to Chancellor Angela Merkel. The position of economic migrants in the labor market depend on the state of the domestic economy and on the political situation, migration police, citizen security issue. Depends on their qualifications, ethnicity, age, sex, religion, and cultural characteristics. For example, the second generation of migrants has hardly integrated into French society. There is cultural isolation and numerous ghettos that the police rarely enter. Significant number of migrants are engaged in the black economy, unreported, unauthorized activities where the tax is avoided. Economic migrants on the labor market fill jobs that the domestic population is not interested in, less attractive jobs. On there is no adequate education, domestic labor for better jobs. There are cases where migrants are
It's strange. What's going on?
example, there are qualified migrants, IT professionals, engineers, managers, highly qualified multi-language learners. In Switzerland, the initiative against mass immigrations was launched by the largest parliamentary party, the Swiss People Party. The arguments of the opponents of migrations were migrants' burden of the social security system, growing crime, rising real estate rent. Switzerland is not pleased to drive with migrants in crowded bus and trains. In Switzerland today, 1/4 of the total population was not born in Switzerland. Not rarely, these migrations are caused by social and state conflicts. Serbia is a predominantly immigrant country. Since 1971, 2011, immigration has increased by 53%. There are 6 waves of immigrations from Serbia. Foreign migrations moves from Serbia push and pull factories, unemployment, economic problems, better earnings, better living conditions, better treatment, education abroad. Serbia, the country of immigration, blue-collar immigrations are from Serbia, Russia, Australia, Deutschland, Switzerland, Italy, French, and USA. Red-collar immigrations are to Serbia, Egypt, Syria, Algeria, Libya, Iran, in Serbia there is decline in birth rate, increased aging population, marked migration, low standard of living, and non-existence of consumer society. The key issue of economic politics in this center, a better life and standards for the poor in the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
So next, I'd like to invite Dr. Jelena Zansky of the European University Institute. Her presentation topic is Understanding Citizenship Policies in Unconsolidated States in the Western Balkans.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So before starting, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. My name is Jelena Jankic, and I coordinate the Global Observatory at the European University Institute, which is a repository, and I would say the world's #1 repository of citizenship legislation and electoral rights. We currently cover 175 countries. And it's my pleasure to tell you that as of 2017, we also cover the citizenship policy of Japan, where our national expert is Professor Atsushi Kondo from Meiji University in Nagoya. Today, I'm going to focus on a conceptual framework for understanding the policies, citizenship policies in the unconsolidated states and the Western Balkans. So rather than presenting empirical evidence that I essentially collected for my book published in 2015, I will today focus on the conceptual framework for understanding citizenship policies in the post-partition, post-conflict environment, and I hope that this projector won't make too much fuss while I'm speaking. So what we all know is that the post-Yugoslav space has disintegrated in a very gradual and uneven manner. So the different post-Yugoslav states have had different partition experiences, which have ranged from a relatively peaceful secession to transition to European Union, EU integration, etc., etc. But we've also had experiences that range through conflict, protracted state transformation, which is something that we can see in the majority of the Western Balkans as they are defined now, and obviously domestic and external contestation. So my argument here is that these different experiences which have largely been driven by the interplay between national identities and the notion of statehood, and I'll come to this in a minute. And these experiences have shaped citizenship regimes in these new states in southeastern Europe. So, let's start from the beginning. Good morning, everyone. When I speak about the notion of statehood here, within the context of this presentation and also in my book, I speak about the articulation of the link between the individuals and the state, which is something that goes beyond the traditional definition of statehood, including the population, territory, the monopoly of legitimate power, and international recognition. So it's essentially how states articulate the link with the people that they have. And this articulation, this link, can be grounded either in the political territorial paradigm or in the national emotional one. And commonly, when in a way this link between the individual and the state is consolidated, we have the reflection of both paradigms, both the political territorial and the national emotional. When either of these elements is contested or challenged at some levels, we have the contestation of statehood, and I'll explain this in more detail throughout the presentation. The notion of citizenship is obviously the relationship between an individual and the state. In international law, it's a mechanism through which states regulate whom they recognize as their members. And when we think about citizenship, we do so through the so-called citizenship triads, which consist of the legal dimension of citizenship, which is citizenship status, so which state do you have the formal membership in, which state do you essentially possess or do not possess the passport of the status, and etc. The second dimension of citizenship is equally relevant because it's the political dimension. It's the dimension of what you give to the state and what the state requires from you and what it gives you in return, meaning the rights and duties of citizenship, including voting rights, social, political, economic rights, but also duties including taxation and, well, in some countries, although the trend is decreasing military duty. Finally, we have the important aspect of the symbolic or the identitarian dimension of citizenship, which comprises all the associations that individuals have towards their formal link to the state. And this is normally articulated, and you see it throughout my presentation, as the symbol of the state, which are commonly ingrained in citizenship policies. So some countries require their naturalization applicants to know the national anthem, to know the national symbols, to accept some common cultural norms that are characteristic of those countries. And those elements of citizenship policies are essentially the symbolic and ideational elements of the notion of citizenship, so the identitarian aspects of the concept of citizenship. Now, the notion of citizenship and its relationship to statehood and identity is important precisely because citizenship policies establish citizenship regimes. And borrowing from gender studies, Joshua and Igor Stix have developed the definition of a citizenship regime as a wider political settlement which reflects not only the political, essentially, contestations between the so-called majorities and minorities, but also political and ideological groups claiming rights within the state. So if you take a look at this definition, and if you take a look at the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, two things come immediately to mind. One would be the Courage judgment from 2010, where the ECDHR decided on the status of the so-called new minorities in Slovenia, so the case of the erased. In the political context of the Balkans, the second part of this definition would essentially be reflected, especially in terms of political rights, of the famous Sejdic and Finci judgment, which we've also mentioned yesterday, reflecting the political rights of the non-constituent communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is why citizenship policies essentially are very much important, not only for defining membership in the state, but also for reflecting rights that different communities have within these states. So essentially, my argument here is that the trajectories of citizenship policy development in post-Yugoslav states are very particular. And the reason for this is something that I'll tell you in a minute. Is that differently from the case of Western European states, citizenship hasn't been purely a mechanism for regulating migration. You could see in the cases of Western Europe that southern cases, the countries that are located towards the south have higher, have more naturalization hurdles, etc., whereas countries with lower net migration have essentially relaxed their citizenship policies. This is not the case in the Southeast European states, including the Western Balkans. Differently also from the Eastern European cases, in the Western Balkans, citizenship policies have not been only a mechanism for regulating minority-related issues, for instance, as has been the case in Slovakia, also in the Baltic states with the cases of non-citizens, etc., but also they have been a mechanism for consolidating statehood and nationhood. And this in countries where statehood and nation had been consolidated, meaning when the state was not challenged by one or more national communities, a mechanism, the primary mechanism for regulating the constitutional dominance of one group over the institutional and constitutional structures of the state has been something that Robert Hayden termed as constitutional nationalism. And this is something you could see, for instance, in the constitutional provisions. Article 1 of the Constitution of Serbia says Serbia is the state of Serbian people and all citizens that live in it, meaning it gives dominance to one ethnic community over others. In other countries, for instance, let's say in my native Montenegro, such a definition was not possible due to the heterogeneous ethnic conception of the country and the contestation of the state that happens at different levels. So the goals of this analytical framework is to essentially enhance our understanding of how citizenship policies in this region have transformed. And essentially, the lack of consolidation of these ethnically heterogeneous states has commonly been due, not only due to external contestation, but also due to domestic disturbances of the institutional structures, which have resulted from intergroup competition. And this is something that pretty much everyone here knows already. As a result of the differences in the evolution of citizenship policies in this region, we essentially need to find an adequate filter for analyzing states that have gone through multiple disintegrations, conflicts, changes of borders, and states that are essentially yet to reach stability both internally and externally. So the framework is inspired by the institutionalist approaches to the study of citizenship, and the problem with institutionalism is that it offers a good account, yet not a completely thorough and applicable account, precisely because it needs two factors, including the analysis of the exogenous factors affecting citizenship, that I'll come to in a minute, and also some broader insights into societal dynamics and power dynamics. So essentially, the two categories of the agents of change in the context of citizenship regimes include the domestic or the endogenous factors, which are composed of elites, ethnic, political, intellectual, economic, etc., but also institutions through which these elites can operate and influence citizenship policies. The second endogenous factor affecting citizenship are societal dynamics. And when I say societal dynamics, I include and assume the institutional and non-institutional bonds that relate individuals to states, meaning not only whether an individual will be a member of the National Council or something like this, but also whether they would go on the streets to protest or to raise their claims in a civic or in an ethnic fashion. And this is something that I would look for. The second aspect are the external factors, which could be horizontal and vertical. The horizontal external factors are those that are essentially at the same level as your state. So normally the neighboring countries, which can either challenge the existence of the country statehood or the dominant identities within it, or they can essentially be supportive of them. And this kind of horizontal interplay essentially reflects the country's approach to dual citizenship in the best way. The vertical external factors are normally international and supranational organizations. In the case of the Western Balkans, it's mostly the European Union to a certain degree, the Council of Europe, but also judgments of different international courts that affect specific provisions in citizenship legislation. So I don't think this chart can be seen well enough. So what I'll try and do is just briefly try and explain how the different elements, including narratives and institutional legacies, domestic factors and external factors, had an effect on citizenship policies. So when the national identity narrative is consolidated and when the country essentially has institutional legacies, it can offer an adequate framework for articulating national identities. We have citizenship policies that are marked by strong ethnic elements, so facilitated admission for ethnic kin, diaspora policies, and liberal dual citizenship. In the region, examples Serbia and Croatia, which extends citizenship to their citizens in the region. When identity narratives are competing, and when you have institutions that unevenly articulate such identities, most obviously in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have a formally de-ethnicized citizenship policy, meaning to become a Bosnian citizen, you don't have to declare belonging to an ethnic community, and you can't have extraterritorial ethnic kinship policies in this kind of states. Equally, the domestic factors can essentially, because I'm running out of time, we can take a bit of this in the discussion, when kind of ethnic elites compete for the dominance over the state, what happens that you cannot have ethnically inclusive policies, while when you have contesting elites, what essentially has, when multiple ethnic elites compete for the dominance of the state structures, the outcome will be ethnoculturally selective citizenship policies. So we'll have restrictive or tolerant approach to dual citizenship, high naturalization barriers, so many years before you can get citizenship in a different country, or no facilitation for ethnic kin. Very similarly, in countries with predominant ethnic communities that function in a homogeneous manner, you will have essentially a consensus on the state's symbols and items such as language, knowledge, articulation of culture, etc., will be ingrained in citizenship policies. I've explained briefly about the effects of the horizontal and vertical external factors. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So as I mentioned, the dual citizenship policies are very much affected by the horizontal factors. And I think if you take a look at which countries in the region allow dual citizenship and which don't, you'll see essentially how those countries relate to their counterparts or the neighboring countries and what the degree of the contestation is. As regards the vertical factors, here you can see that throughout the visa liberalization process, which happened between 2008 to 2009 in the Western Balkans, countries were required to change some aspects of their citizenship legislation. And they did this because it emanated from an external vertical factor, and they received a reward. So they got their cookie for behaving well and changing their citizenship regime. So this is where you can see the greatest changes in the citizenship regimes of these countries. So just quickly, I hope that in a way decomposing the different elements that can affect a country's citizenship policies are the best way to understand it, because each citizenship policy essentially mirrors the interplay between statehood and the same or the different national identities within the state. So as you could see in the post-Yugoslav states, there is a significant number of legal provisions that depend on the dynamics of state and nation building. However, these can be changed and reshaped in the context where international factors, either horizontal or vertical, also affect those policies. And I'll leave some more concrete examples for the discussion because my time has been up for the last 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next I would like to invite the third speaker, Dr. Murat Ezelhaus, and then of Tsukuba University. And her presentation topic is in brackets, Civil War literature in a transnational context, a relational studies approach to Lazkani and al-Bahari. So Dr. Ezelhaus, please.
I'm a professor for literature, so it will be slightly different, but I think some of the things that were said yesterday can be connected also to what I'm going to say. I will talk about my project in relational studies and tell you a little bit about relational studies on global crisis from a literary perspective, and then I have two examples, Fania Lazkani and David al-Bahari. So the name of my research project 2 years ago, Transnational Encounter, the European Refugee Crisis, and it's now coming to an end. And I was interested in how the influx of refugees, what impact it has on literature written in the German language. And this is part of the bigger group project of relational studies in global crisis. Basically, what I wanted to do, that's the research plan, was to have a look at German welcome culture, the nexus of literature and refugees, and then in the second year to look at opponents to immigration and the Japanese perspectives. And what I'm basically looking at is, you see in the orange box, narratives and discourses, expression and communication. What was important is that because it was not an individual research project, to keep in mind the relationship between literature studies and the relational studies in global crisis. So this is a little bit what I did. On the topic of welcome culture, I did a lot of research on terminology in Germany and history. You cannot imagine how many words they have in Germany for foreigners coming to the country. So in detail, political and legal terminology concerned with all kinds of people moving into Germany. Historical and ideological terminology back to World War II. And from that, rethinking German refugee history, because most people probably are not aware of to what extent Germany has been permeated by refugees in the last 70 years. Even though it claims it is not an immigration country. The second part was more about welcome culture, explicitly, and the opposition to welcome culture. And there I was interested in narratives of welcome culture as written in literature or written in other texts. Then particularly Germany as an aging society, what came up just now, and the activism of senior citizens together with refugees. And then concerning opposition, political exchange, the verbal battles over immigration. And the literature part on literature and refugees in general was literature on the refugee crisis, as it was perceived and written about by people who suffered this and, oh, thank you.
Yes.
Who suffered, who were refugees, but also about how the Germans reacted to this. So German literature, and when I say literature, it's basically about Bellletto, German literature on what was going on in Germany, and then literary topics of flight and expulsion, because at the same time, German literature itself was very much interested in the history of ancestry and in how Germans had been expelled from other countries and had moved to Germany, and that's like 10 to 12 million people moving into Germany after World War II. And then the literature by refugees or former refugees. So some people, they're not, of course, wouldn't know the German language when they come to Germany, and after a while they learn the language, maybe become German and start to write even in German about the experience as a refugee. The other guideline then was, at the beginning I thought this is about Germany, transnationalist Germany and host country and newcomers. And then I realized that's much more complicated. And of course they are not only the Syrians, if we focus on that, but strange enough, some Iraqi former refugees stood up and talked for the Syrians and wrote novels and stories about their experience as refugees in Germany 10 years earlier. And so I started to learn more about Iraqis and read Iraqi literature, and then refugees from Yugoslavia. Yeah, in the 90s, that's the first big wave of refugees to Germany. So there is multidimensional effects if you study this, and there's relationality in terms of time, space, and even focus. And then just a short slide to show you mobility to Germany, a timeline. So there is, in fact, German refugees, ex-police, and then repatriates and late repatriates up to the 80s, where 4 million late repatriates came into Germany. Then you had the migrant workers, the so-called guest workers in the 50s, 60s. And then you have reunification, which was not easy, and there was an inner German East-West conflict going on, mobility from the east to the west, taking the jobs, and from the west to the east, searching for jobs. And then you had the refugees from ex-Yugoslavia and Iraq, and now the situation of Syrian refugees, and of course all the other refugees. So actually Germany is a place where people just move to, or have been moving to in the last 70 years, which is very often overseen. And for that reason, German society today is very heterogeneous. Yeah? So they are the Germans, the former West Germans, the former East Germans, there are have Germans with migration background, without migration background. There are post-unification Germans, the young ones who have no idea that there were two Germanys before. Then there are foreign workers in Germany, EU citizens in Germany, Germans who live abroad, don't really know what's going on in Germany, ethnic minorities, and asylum seekers, and. So that's a very different society from what it was 70 years ago. Now, returning to literature, how can we organize literature in view of this situation? For example, here we have some authors. Clockwise, Elaine Feinstein is her grandparents moved as Jews from Ukraine to Great Britain. Elfriede Jelinek, you know, the Nobel Prize winner from Austria. Ulrike Dresner wrote about her ancestry fleeing after World War II. David Al-Bahari, from a Serbian writer in Canada at the moment. Jenny Erpenbeck writing about the situation in Germany as a German. Abbas Frida is an Iraqi who wrote about the situation of refugees. And Talia Laskani is a refugee from Syria, if you want to call her a refugee. How can we organize this literature? I mean, does it make sense to talk about German literature? And that's my doubt. So, what we used to do in literary studies is we had actually two boxes where to put these people. Traditionally, we have either individual literatures, and then we have general and comparative literature. The individual literatures are organized either for linguistic or national reasons. For example, Syrian, English, French, Iraqi, German, Austrian, Russian, Jewish, Serbian, just to mention the people I just mentioned before. And then what you can do if people don't fit in these two boxes, you come up with new boxes. And there we have all kinds of boxes like migrant literature, which is different from migration literature, which is different from diaspora literature, which is different from transnational literature and intercultural literature. And what you do is you take your authors and you put them in the little boxes. And that's very difficult for students nowadays, I think. It's just too old. It's not our world anymore. And we're in desperate need as literary researchers, I think, to come up with a new model. So how can we organize literature? This is actually the situation. You know, these authors, they don't just know one language, and they don't just know one culture, and they're not sitting in one country, closing their door. Yeah, they all know about each other. They quote each other. There is an intertextuality that is huge. So how can we organize this? And this, of course, is not very convincing because it looks like a spider web or something. So let's look at it. What you can do is you can start with a question. And I'm just doing it as an example from what I did this time. So my question was, we have the Syrian civil war, we have refugees, they move to Germany. What does that do with literature? What's the result of that for literature? And then I very quickly realized there were the refugees from Iraq before, and there is an Iraqi influence on German literature and also on the Syrians who are coming to Germany. And then there is, at the same time, the World War II expellees, because the Germans are on the one hand interested in these refugees, but at the same time they're remembering their own past, their grandparents coming to Germany. But when you talk about expellees, you have to talk about Nazism and German racism, contemporary racism and Nazism in the past. Then you, of course, realize that there were the people from Yugoslavia before, and you have connection Yugoslavia, Syria, Germany, and the like. And then Germany is an aging society, as we just learned, and that connects Germany actually to Japan, which is a country that has not yet realized that it should be more interested in refugees in order to deal with the aging society problem. And then you also have World War I, connecting Iraq and Yugoslavia and Germany and all these countries, so it's just not a problem that started right now. You can think about hospitality as welcome culture, and then you have to talk about Turkey, because actually they down there are doing a lot more than we in Europe. And so you start to read literature in Turkey, and that connects to World War I and to Yugoslavia again. And then you can talk about suffering and mourning, and that connects everybody. And so that's the kind of literary studies that we could do now. That's a new program I'm offering at my university. This relational studies in literature and culture. And what does it change? To traditional literary studies, you lose the image of archives and retrospection in literary studies. You do away with thinking in the box, migration literature or Austrian literature. You do away with labeling such as migrant, German, and forward nationalism. You get rid of preconceived canons and have to create your own work in progress. Very important for students, I think. You focus on the relating, relating to and relating the story gesture of literature. You offer students an appropriate new approach to our changing global world. You have to relate to the world and situate literature in external context, and you should know at least 3 languages. That's what I always tell my Japanese students. But when they listen to me in English, they already know Japanese and English, so it's just one more language to learn. So I have 2 more, 2 authors I would like to tell you about. Like a concrete example, what can we do now? How can we understand refugee literature and civil war literature from an outside perspective? That's very important. I'm not a specialist on Serbian literature or Syrian literature. I can neither read Serbian nor Arabic. So I'm looking at this as an outsider. And on the other hand, how can literature relate unique experience, loss, fate, mourning in a transnational context? How to employ narrative techniques to convey otherness. That's what it's basically about. So the lack of experience may be transformed into an experience of otherness. And the limits of communication and understanding may give you more ideas about otherness and the meaning of silence. Otherness, especially in its radical form of suffering, is always difficult to understand. And then the term of grievability. Very important, I think, with refugee literature or civil war literature, the possibilities and impossibilities of mourning, and there's the name Judith Butler. So I have to do this very fast. I just give you a few examples. One is Fadia Laskani, a Syrian who is living in Paris, who experienced 9 years in prison in Syria and is a psychologist. And on the other hand, David Al-Bahadi is a Serbian who lives in Canada and is a real writer, wrote a lot of stories while Laskani is just a psychologist. Her story, just the contents at the bottom, it's about 2 brothers of a young Syrian woman who had disappeared in the political turmoil of post-1983 Syria. The older brother leaves prison after 11 years. He says the younger brother was killed in prison and offers witnesses for this. The sister cannot believe her younger brother's death, and the story is about her search for information about her younger brother, her disbelief, and her coming to terms with his death. And there's one, there are some who would like to give you just one quote to get an idea about the literature. So at the beginning of her story is, I come from a planet filled with questions that have no answers. A planet where all that is said is true and all that is true is said. The hearts of its residents carry the craziness of the question, one that haunts them, whether they are awake or asleep in a land that conceals its secrets. Neither the tree branches nor the sidewalk offer any answers. I'll shorten this a little bit. So Laskani reduces historical information to a minimum and generalizes the plot. Only the informed reader can read between the lines. The uninformed reader is invited to look for more information, but doesn't get enough within the story. She uses poetic and metaphorical language and imagery to attract the reader. She tells the story from a suffering sister's perspective, inviting empathy in spite of her own experience. The female narrator's speech act is reduced to questions without receiving answers. Laskani radicalizes the problem of grievability by the absence of her brother. And in the end, she offers closure and grievability. And the other author is David Al-Bahari. I'll just put 2 minutes for it. Yeah. So one story by him, the table, that's the story. Of all things on the table, only one is not sharp. That's the story. And that is a real story, because you suddenly realize how a person can look at a table and look at things And so you have the whole story of violence and fear and defense or whatever victim in the back of this little story. Another example from Mamas, which is a novel by him. And what did I know then about pain, about loss? Nothing. At best, although this phrase sounds hopelessly wrong to me when it's a question of pain, I believe that pain is connected with guilt. Someone I believed was guilty for my pain. Someone I believed was guilty for my father's death. Now I know that the pain should not be sought in others, but that we always carry it along with us. That pain is the center that makes us what we are. And I'll skip this, and skip that too. And so, yeah, let's say in general, as a conclusion, all texts that I treated here in a relational studies perspective focus on the problem of understanding and how artistic expression can be extrapolated from concrete experience and question concepts of identity and otherness, and thereby they bypass ethnicity, as I said in my little commentary yesterday. And so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we would like to invite our fourth speaker, Dr. Milos Besic of University of Belgrade. And his presentation topic is how many truths are over there. Reconciliation and agonistic dialogue in the post-conflict Balkan.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much again for your kind invitation, and I'm glad to be here. Special thanks to my friend, old friend Hugo Kici. Well, it was very interesting yesterday. Obviously, it's going to be interesting today, since, according to my point of view, like, we have very diverse situation here. It is diversity in terms of epistemology, theory, approaches, even regions and different ideas. So I will hopefully contribute to this diversity concept, and I will talk today about the reconciliation process in Western Balkan society. Actually, what I'm going to present today at the very beginning, and that means 2014. That was kind of a rather huge research that I have done for the United Nations Development Program in New York. And the very idea of the research was that we should provide some kind of evaluational framework for the insofar efforts that has been done regarding the reconciliation process in Balkan societies. So what we actually wanted to do is to analyze a number of reconciliation projects in the region. When I'm talking about the region, in their terminology, the region was like former Yugoslavia minus Slovenia plus Albania, and usually it goes recently in this kind of arrangements, but that's fine. But in this presentation of mine, I will not deal with Albania, because the very issue that I'm going to stress today, it's kind of very different when we speak about Albania, and we can talk about some significant similarities as far as we speak about other five countries. So, actually, the countries, our main problem was like very simple. It's like after more than 20 years of the after more than 20 years, this region is not reconciled, obviously, and moreover, we are like moving regressive in last, let's say, 5 or 6 years or so. So it doesn't look very good. And of course, there is a question, main question. We put so much effort from many possible points of view in investments in the reconciliation process, and well, it doesn't work. I mean, the main question, or one of the main questions, would be, okay, can we identify the main problem, the main obstacles that are not providing the progressive road toward reconciliation? And as I said, we use kind of rather extensive empirical material. The method that we have used is content analysis and expert evaluation, meaning that we literally took a number of projects, reconciliation projects from each country, and we provide content and analysis of that rather huge material. But also, in each country, we have had expert evaluators who were asked to reflect upon that empirical material in accordance to some semi-structured metrics. So we have had these two kinds of informations, which are to much extent about reconciliation as such, but also they are about the very project that has been realized. Of course, we couldn't use any kind of probability sampling. We do not have a list of all these projects, but we used some reasonable criteria for non-probability propulsive sampling so that we can cover different regions and different topics and let's say significant reconciliation projects and activities that have been realized. In a methodological point of view, when it comes to data analysis, I've used so-called GTA, it's a grounded theory approach, Strauss and Corbin, of course, which means that you are coming from the ground, from the very empirical data, and you're developing through open codes, your focus codes, and then the final concepts. So, as I said, we took a number of projects, and each of them, I mean, the amount of empirical data was rather huge. And this is the number of the reconciliation projects and initiatives that has been analyzed during this research. Now, if we go back just a little bit, you know, when we start from some kind of reasonable literature view, the main problem that I faced at the very beginning, and I have to stress this, I'm an empirically oriented sociologist, so when it comes to certain concepts, from my empirical point of view, it's very important to make kind of division between them so that I can know what to measure, okay, or what to observe. But there are so many concepts there, they're so interconnected and related that it's very hard to extract reconciliation as such, regardless of all these concepts. But of course, there are many aspects, like someone who talk about legislation and the institution and legislative aspects, someone who talk about the instruments and measures that should be done in order to provide the road to reconciliation, someone who talk about illustration, amnesty, reparation, DDR, SSR, you know, all these different mechanisms and procedures coming from the different ideas of reconciliation. Some would be like, you know, based on psychological and emotional aspects, some on institutional aspects, and you know, it's hard to see how all these things relate to each other. But I would just come to some main authors that are accepted, let's say, okay, which would put the paradigm of reconciliation as the main one. Probably the most famous one would be Bloomfield, you know, and that's the so-called idea handbook, and his manuscript on the good terms of reconciliation. And well, if you check out what Bloomfield is talking about reconciliation and other authors, you could find some significant similarities regardless the terminology that has been used. So like 4 pillars for the Bloomfield would be truth, justice, healing, and reparations. And for example, for Facebook would be shared truth again, and justice, regarding security, and then Leatherick, it would be peace, justice, truth, and mercy. And then Renick and Fonseca, again, truth, memory, healing, forgiveness, okay, again, some very closely related concepts. But in all these cases, the very concept actually and substantially rely on truth. And if you just analyze reasonably and logically, other concepts or pillars of a reconciliation, you would find that, without that first one, the main pillar, truth, none of them is possible. And again, if you go further, if you talk about confidence or empathy, these are terms very important for other authors, relationship building or social cohesion, all of them heavily depends on truth. So the main thing it appeared to me when I made that kind of ground theory approach, so that the notion of truth came up as the main notion that we should talk about, that we should reflect upon. Well, reasonably and undoubtedly, we can say that there are so many truths over there, and each side has their own truth, and all of them are recalling the past, but they see past differently as well, and they interpret past differently as well. And each past has its own past, and that very perception of the past, this is also very different comparing to different dimensions, different ethnic communities. Well, because any kind of politics here in Balkan is practically ethnopolitics. And every ethnic community has their own vision of themselves and others, of course. But what makes the difference here in the Balkan and in some other spheres is that there is no negotiation between the parts about the truth, and there is no one to impose, let's say, or construct some universal truth. Which means that you should base the process of reconciliation and truth without agreement what the truth is. And you do not have some kind of external or internal force to impose one and only truth. The main thing is that in each ethnic community and in each state, the reconciliation process, as well as war, happened during the transitional period of socialist society, that's one thing, and during the nation-state building process. So the very war and the very reconciliation process was just a part of aspect of this important historical task and goal to be achieved, which is nation-state. And every single action and every single truth is just a mean for establishing nation-state. Of course, some objective, factual truth will not have good perspective from this point of view. And in each society and for each ethnic group, you have so-called patriotic structure that are very strong in defending patriotic truth. And it's not only about them. They have strong support by the church, by the educational system, by the media. If you just make a content analysis or any kind of simple analysis of media and their content, you would say that there is nothing, or it's so little about facts. It's about perspectives and defending ethnic truth, which is a main mean to achieve the historical goal, which is building your own nation state. And you have that huge, and you have some voices, claiming for the real actual truth, but they're like weak. And you have so-called, or I call it, power asymmetry. On one side, you have patriotic structures and educational system, and church and all this, and media, and everything is, in a position to defend a nationalistic truth. And on the other side, you have small parties, some small parties, political parties, or some individuals, or some small NGOs, which are treated as traitors. They're traitors not because, they are traitors because they are asking for the factual truth, actually. Because they're betraying their own nation. And this is a problem. This is a problem. So, what kind of truth do we really need? And this is one of the very important notions. When you check the literature and when you think about the issue, it's when we are talking about reconciliation, it's a mixture of the idea, that reconciliation is a process, but reconciliation must have some goal, which means that we need some idea how this reconciled society should look like. And you have this concept of rebuilding relationship, of rebuilding institution, but it's not about rebuilding, because the society disappeared. The society that the very conflict comes from. It's about building new institutions, it's about building new identity, it's about building new state. And that kind of building perspective heavily jeopardizes all these efforts which are about the process of reconciliation. But still, okay, my question would be, okay, how the reconciled society should look like? It must be the society with new identity, and that new identity must include conflicting parts, conflicting history. It cannot be, that you should just expel that past, conflicting past. So, in fact, in order to do so, from my and Nemanja, I'm sorry I didn't mention Nemanja, we are working together on this piece. So, it's idea that, we should stop try imposing one and only factual universal truth. What we can do is to allow coexistence of different truths. And it's possible. And there are many cases in this research project that I found that it is possible. Moreover, we find some mechanisms that can significantly contribute to that goal. And we call that double truth principle, or agonistic truth, or agonistic dialogue. You can put it any way you want. I'm a empirical sociologist, I don't care very much about words. What I care is what this word means. In my point of view, we need a shared vision of the reconciled society based on a double truth principle. And the very truth should be, or that double truth principle, should actually introduce the idea of reconciled society where each side recognizes, admits, and understands the perspective, needs, and perception of others. Not negating, but accepting. But if both sides do so, we have that kind of dialectics that provide the possibility of the new identity of the reconciled society. So we have like vision how this society should look like. And from my point of view, it's very, very important. I didn't see, it's different. When you set, for example, for Desmond Tutu, reconciliation would be like achieving forgiveness. And for someone, it would be just peaceful coexistence. It's a huge difference between them. If peaceful coexistence is the goal of reconciliation, then it's done, pretty much it's done. I mean, we're fine. But it's not. And some important aspects and notions that I want to stress. Okay, the reconciliation process has so many levels and actors. I listened yesterday and today as well, meso, micro, macro, there are so many in between. It's so complex, and it's not easy to put that all together. But you should calculate that the problem can come, that it just overflows. It comes from institutional to political level, from political to social psychological level, from that level goes to institutional level, so it's a mixture. And you have to account for all that. And another question is, so who we do reconcile? Is it about reconciling the communities, or states, or nations? It's one thing when you talk about reconciliation, and you can see that very, very clearly from the project that has been analyzed. It's one thing when you are like delivering reconciliation project or package, on the border where those people get involved into the war, and when you have a project, between people who are just all the time they were relatively far from the war events. So this is another notion, and again, I think that I will finish with this idea. We need some kind of strategy because it doesn't work so far. It just doesn't work. Okay, we can say, okay, we cannot do anything, so and that's it. Okay, but if there is any kind of effort, like political effort, it should heavily account for the fact that structural forces social forces, in this case, ethnic identities and state-building process, shapes every single aspect of political life. And you cannot just come from above and solve the problem like, that they are fighting for, 2 aisles or anything, okay? It doesn't work like that way. And it's very, very clearly from this project how it works. So we need we need a strategical approach, and since the problem was regional, the strategy should be regional as well. And when you have a strategy, then you have a goal. One of the problems when I was evaluating all these projects, it's what's the criterion for evaluation? Usually you have a strategy, and there are goals and means and measurements, so there is something that you can use for the evaluation. In this case, you do not have. Without strategy, simply it wouldn't work. So, in my point of view, and this is my final sentence, in my point of view, we need double truth principle, we need consensus upon that double truth principle, we need regional strategy, and we need a clear vision of the future, how the reconciled society should look like after the process of effective and successful reconciliation. Thank you very much.
So after hearing all these very nice and insightful presentations on, related to citizenship and human movement in and after the conflict, we would like to invite our discussant, Dr. Aiko Nishikida of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for your presentation. And actually, yesterday I talked about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but these days I myself is more focusing on the migrants issue, so I learned actually a lot from your nice papers and presentations. But because each presentation was very rich in content, and I'm sure you all have many questions in the floor, so I will limit my questions and comments to the minimum. For first, to Mariana, your presentation, it was, I think, a great summary of about the globalization and migration, what is happening in the current world, and what is the trend, and what is the cause of the migration. I also learned a lot from that presentation, and specific for me, interesting thing was like average age. You mentioned about a specific thing about average ages. And it is actually, I think, not really usually mentioned in this detail in the presentation, in the consideration of migration. And I also noticed that Germany and Japan is the highest number. Yeah, it was very interesting for me. And also about the routes to the European countries. They usually mention only like the Balkan routes or the Central Mediterranean routes, and like only 3 routes, but you mentioned 8 routes. So it was also new information for me, and I learned a lot. So those are very interesting points for me. And because your work, so your focus is more on shedding light on the general picture of the migration and globalization, I guess. But based on these presentations, I actually wanted to know. I was more interested in about the situation of Serbia. Because you also mentioned about the situation in Serbia, most of the people are emigrating to the Western European countries and America, right? And people are coming from the Arab countries and Africa to Serbia. So, but what you were mentioning about immigration to the country from Egypt, Syria, Libya, are these countries immigration actually stay in Serbia, or just they pass by Serbia and go to the other countries? This is my first question to you. And the second question is, and considering these global trends of migration, what can you say about the characteristics of Serbia, migration in and passing through Serbia? What do you think is typical about Serbia's situation? That is my second question. I want to know about it. What is typical about the migration situation in Serbia? So, the second presentation to the Elena's talk about citizenship policy in the Western Balkans, I think I actually learned a lot more from the theoretical point of view. And it was really insightful for me because usually when I study about citizenship, usually it is more like a domestic-based one, or more like a limited spheres of discussions. But you were pointing out more like open and bringing in many aspects also to the citizenship theory. So, and especially when you pointed out the difference between the citizenship policy in the Western countries, which is like a regulating migration system, which is regulating migration, and the differences in Balkans and the Southeast European countries, which is actually consolidating statehood and nationhood. It is actually really interesting in contrast for me. And also you were pointing out the external factors for the citizenship. And I think it is quite interesting because usually citizenship is considered to be a national thing. So, but you are pointing out the external influence to this citizenship. But my question is actually relating to these external factors because it's very insightful. But for me, actually, it's a bit like still vague. I mean, especially for the vertical aspect, because horizontal aspect is kind of clear because it means kind of like a dual citizenship, so it's rather clear. But for the vertical aspect, the influence from the international organizations to the citizenship in domestic countries. What do you exactly mean, or if you can raise some examples, how does it affect to the citizenship in countries? This is my first question. And the second question is, you are also mentioning about nation building, concerning the citizenship, right? By this nation, what do you mean? I mean, what is a nation for the Yugoslavian literature and the context? I think this is a quite big question, but if you can give me some idea about it, I would be appreciated. And so the third paper by Professor Hazelhouse, I learned a lot about also the refugees issues, and I think that especially about the literature about migration. And I learned it was what was interesting for me, especially was about the writing about what is unwritable. Let's say, like literature of silence, questioning, and grievability. I mean, writing about silence is kind of like literally it sounds like a kind of contradictory, but I think it is very important point when we focus on the literature of migration. And I think you were pointing out a very elegant way, especially in your PowerPoints. And my question is, but more related to your theoretical contribution, because you are emphasizing about the relational studies and its framework, shedding light on the literature's analysis, right? So, and you were, in that point of view, I think I can somehow understand about your main former studies about the German literature and the two works which you picked up for this presentation today. Like one literature about the Syrian refugees in France, and the other literature was about the Serbian refugees in Canada. But maybe, of course, from the point of view of relational studies, everything can be connected in somehow in the relations. But for me, actually, it was not really clear how those 3 points, like German literature and Syrian refugees, the art about Syrian refugees, and in France, and the art about the Serbian refugees in Canada, how are these connected, and why did you choose these works for your presentations? So if you can tell me more about it, I think I can more understand about your concept of relational studies. And also, if you can elaborate more, the second question is if you can elaborate more about outsiders' perspectives. You were pointing out outsiders' perspectives when you were analyzing these literatures. And what became clear from outsiders' perspective, if you can elaborate, I think I would appreciate it. And for the last presentation by Professor Miloš, I learned a lot about domestic context about this reconciliation in Serbia and in the former Yugoslavia and the framework about it. And actually, and also what you pointed out was, I think, very important in comparative perspective as well, because all societies shares this problem of reconciliation. And all those societies have many truths. And we are trying to struggle how to manage for reconciliation among those conflicting parts, fragments of the society. And in that sense, your presentation was very stimulating. And what I want to ask from you is coexistence. You mentioned about coexistence of different truths. And I think I agree that it's very important. But for example, if you can elaborate in which way there can be the coexistence of different truths, because it is usually as is well known, discussed in the textbook or educational system, and there should be some more conflicts in the Yugoslavian context as well. I mean, so I want to learn more about it. And you were talking about also this is the first point. And the second point is you pointed out the necessity of creating a new identity, right, in a post-conflict society. But this new identity, I think it's important, but I wonder on what basis these identities would be created. So, because there should be so many elements existing already, so I want to learn more about it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nishikina. So our four precious speakers, could you please make your first responses in the order of media presentations? So, okay.
Thank you very much for your questions. Well, I probably for these 10 minutes cannot elaborate everything. I will answer on both of your questions. First, I will answer on the second question, and it is about how this society post-reconciled society should look like, and what is the basis of that new identity, okay? Well, the fact is that, you know, if you ask so many people, or many people, Serbs, they will still say here that Srebrenica never happened. They just don't want to admit that something like that happened, okay? So, what they would argue, it's like, okay, don't talk me about Srebrenica, they will speak about the crimes of other sides. Okay? And for the other side, again, vice versa. So, okay? So, it seems to be that it could be possible to put all these two truths on the table, not to insist just on a single one. That is a matter of your own perspective. Look, when they talk about, for example, victimization and victims, you know, the victims, they're just those who belong to us. They're not victims. They're just, you know, collateral damage for our eyeballs, and do not talk about them. That makes a wrong decision. There is one of these reconciliation projects very interesting coming from Novi Pazar. And that case of Novi Pazar, there is a guy, Serbian guy. Novi Pazar is mostly Muslim populations over there in majority. Srđan Aleksić was a Serb who died by defending their neighbors who were Muslims from the Serbian forces. And what actually happened over there is that after the war officially stopped in that Sandžak region, there was an initiative from the NGO sector, Muslim NGO sector, that guy should get a monument. Because he was like a Serb who died to protect neighbor Muslims from the Serbs. And politicians would not allow that. Muslim politicians would not allow that. There can be no hero if it's Serbian, regardless of the fact that he defends Muslims. So you see, you know, everything is put in that perspective. So my idea is that, of course, the issue of agency is very, very important. That power asymmetry is very, very important. If you have strong nationalistic structures from above, and you have political agents, parties, you know, from up there, and they're working together. Everything in between is like in canyon. It doesn't work like that. So this is the real question, or part of the answer of your question, how it looks like. So first, we should put all these truths on the table, okay? And it would be possible, you know, many Serbs will admit Serbian crimes if they admit their crimes, and vice versa. So let's do so. And that society with new identity should integrate the conflicting past. We cannot just forget about conflicting past and build a new identity as a nation-state identity, because it will always be there as a structural factor. And possibly, it could always make new problem in the future, like it happens, you know? We have had a similar situation in Second World War, and we were peaceful for 50 years, and all these same forces. Yesterday we have had very interesting presentation for our colleague from Croatia. You saw what happened with monuments and all this stuff. You know, just erase the history. Just change the perspective of history, you know? What I say, you know, our future is the only thing that we are certain, because past you can change whenever you want. That's just the thing of perception. And there is one more argument, okay? What is the alternative for reconciliation in the region? Is there any alternative? No. It must happen sooner or later. And this is a very heavy calculation, but by a very, I would say, clever, but in a wrong way, clever calculation, but by nationalistic structures all over the region. They know this sometimes, you know, what it is, you know, it must be as it is. But this is not an alternative for the real reconcile in the region. So I know it's not easy, but what I know, what I'm more sure, comparing that this task is not easy, is do nothing, or just work on reconciliation with any idea what is our goal. I cannot understand that you have some policy program without strict goals. This could be one of them. It's not idealistic, it's possible, based on the experience and research and documentations and all these projects that I have analyzed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Mariana.
Serbia emigrated in Germany, Austria, French, USA because unemployment, better living, better conditions, better treatments. First question is a difficult question. Globalization is increase of inequality, many conflicts, migrations. Europe is a country of immigration. The immigration now very significant in the world. His big problem last decade, 20th century, it's big more in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aiko, for these inspiring questions. You're absolutely right in the sense that when we think about citizenship nowadays, we normally still have this sort of paradigm that also Roger Brubaker spoke about, of citizenship being an exclusive national domain and the last bastion of national sovereignty, etc., etc. However, kind of as a result of globalization, but not only, also other dynamics that happen between states and also at the international level, we also have to acknowledge the existence of external factors that shape citizenship policies in a number of countries. On a different project that I'm working on at the moment, and I'm looking at countries that sell their passports, one external influence that you can see are these international companies that lobby with governments for changing citizenship legislation. And this is an obvious external factor that essentially shows that citizenship policy is no longer an exclusive national domain. Back to the Balkans. Most of the post-Yugoslav states have at some point signed up to the European Convention on Nationality, which is a document of the Council of Europe regulating in a way, in a broad sense, or trying to harmonize the regulation of citizenship across various states that are members of the Council of Europe. And to give you a very concrete example, once Macedonia signed up to the European Convention on Nationality, changed its citizenship law to essentially reduce the residence condition from 15 to 8 years. Also changed the provisions for how long you have to be married to a person, whether you can claim citizenship if the marriage dissolves, if the spouse dies, etc., etc. That's one example. A second example would be the thing that I briefly mentioned, and I'm sorry for the misunderstanding because I couldn't go into details. During the visa liberalization process, which was hugely important for many of the post-Yugoslav states which were blacklisted, so they needed visas to enter any of the Schengen states. So during the process of negotiating the removal from Annex 1 and insertion into Annex 2, so the abolition of visas, what these former Yugoslav countries had to do was they had to regulate statelessness that had been caused by the wars of Yugoslav disintegration. So a number of states essentially introduced provisions in their citizenship laws to regulate the status of people who had been affected or who had to move as a consequence of the wars of Yugoslav disintegration. And the final example that I wanted to give you is, well, it's a part of the broader citizenship policy. It's the example of extradition in Croatia, which was a constitutional provision related to citizenship policy, because the state has the duty to protect its citizens. And you cannot extradite your citizens only unless there is a bilateral treaty regulating such extradition. When Croatia was negotiating to enter the European Union, they also signed up to this European arrest warrant, in which case the country is obliged to extradite to another EU member state its own national, meaning rupturing the link between the individual and the state. Croatia had to change its constitution and its constitutional provision related to the extradition of its own citizens. So the duty to protect, in a way, on behalf of the state had been altered by the dynamics of EU integration. And some of you may remember that Angela Merkel didn't attend the party of Croatia through when it entered the European Union, because there was a controversial case between Croatia and Germany regarding extradition at the time. So to come to your second question, are people able to be sure there on this one? That's a very difficult one, and I could speak for at least 3 hours. In one of my papers that I wrote a couple of years ago, I kind of followed James Mayall's definition of nationalism and national identity. He said it's like a black box in which you just put in whatever you can't put anywhere else, which is in a way the way we think of nation, national identity, and nationalism more broadly. Thinking about it very structurally and empirically, you can see the nation or national identity as something that has 2 dimensions. One is the cognitive one. How do you think of yourself in relation to a group, to a bounded collectivity? Meaning that you, as an individual, you ascribe yourself to a broader community, and this community has its boundaries, right? Given the fact that this community has its boundaries, you, in a way, consider it also as relational. So you relate within the community and also to other bounded collectivities. And this is the approach to the nation that I've taken throughout my kind of papers, my books, meaning a collectivity of ascription, which is by no means fixed, but in a way very, very immutable, and very much dependent on a number of different elements, which I can't enumerate as they here. Most of all, just stop. Thank you.
Basic talked about reconciliation, and that's like 25 years later. And if you look at the Germans and the Jews in 70 years, and where's reconciliation? Reconciliation is extremely difficult and extremely utopian and optimistic. And I think to go back one step, be careful and just talk about humanity, and try not to talk about the sites and the ethnicities, but talk about what we have in common, and that is the suffering. And one of the lines from Al-Bahari was that I connect suffering with guilt, and they killed my father, and that's why I suffered. And then I learned that the suffering is in me, and is with me. And so I think one possibility, and also answering to yesterday, one possibility for literature is to step back and very carefully take account of what we can think and how we can argue, and step back to try to maybe find the most common ground, which is simply, and there we're close again, that everybody has been suffering and believes they have been suffering, and everybody believes they have suffered the most. And maybe we can work with that. And if that is the case, then the topic of literature can only be suffering, pain, loss, grievability, and otherness. And then we actually are always others. We're always outsiders. If that's the advantage in this case of being the outsider, that you have to ask much more carefully what happened, what is going on. And I selected these texts because they do not give you the historical information. If you don't know them, you can't read between the lines. You have to start and look it up. That's the first action I think that literature can force you to do, is try and find out why 1983? What is that massacre I never heard about? Yeah? And then start to get involved and learn about it, and then also learn about who you are. And for that, you need to be an outsider, I think. And there, that connects to a very practical problem I have. I'm teaching this to Japanese students, who have not the slightest idea what we're talking about. Yeah, because they are really in a comfort zone. And to get them to understand what is going on this globe and what is going on in literature, and make them part of this, is the practical side of what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and all of your insightful feedbacks. So we still have like 10 minutes or so. So open for Q&A session or making comment, please. So let's collect a few comments and questions, and then we return back to the speakers. So please, any microphone?
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the panel. A quick comments to head on, and I really enjoyed your presentation a lot. I look forward to seeing what comes up to this. I found that fascinating. I mean, there are a number of authors that came to mind, not necessarily from a German perspective, but in thematic, relational. Hisham Matar's, the Libyan author, he went back to Libya from Britain. His father was killed by Gaddafi. It's called The Return. It's brilliant. Samar Yazbek, who's a Syrian Alawite living in France, did a book about going back to Syria during the civil war called The Crossing. I would even say Joseph Roth's work is this sort of migration trauma story. So I think you've tapped a really rich seam that's going to keep delivering. And, my question or observation is to Dr. Besic. I mean, my sense of what's retarded reconciliation regionally, and it's not the only factor, but I'd say it's a dominant one, is the regimes in the region thrive on preventing reconciliation, re-traumatizing populations as a means to maintain power.
That's the whole structure.
Yeah, they never let people get over it. So it's not that the repository is simply from below, it's constantly reinforced from the top. And therefore I have very limited faith that anything that's politically driven can ever be strategic other than just another bullshit project factory that can actually attain something. You have lots of micro or smaller level efforts that are reconciliatory, or at least dealing with people's common humanity across the boundaries that these conflicts created and maintain. But I'm very dubious about anything that comes officially, because there's a conflict of interest. So that's just my observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please pass around.
Thank you.
So two more comments.
Thank you. My name is Kirsty Campbell from the University of St Andrews. Kurt actually kind of stole my question. So I'll just add to it for Professor Besic. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. My area is Northern Ireland, and I really resonated with your presentation. There's very many similarities. My argument would be in Northern Ireland the same. This consociational system tries to maintain society in silos. So from the top down, reconciliation isn't present at all. And actually the elites would try to counter reconciliation as Kurt says. My question is, does the NGO sector have the capacity to counter that from the bottom up in the Western Balkans?
NGO sector.
Yeah, NGOs, yeah. That's a simple question for you. Thank you.
I'm afraid I give the same question. It's a very similar line, but actually thank you very much for your presentation. And as you know, that I'm studying with Iraq, and post-war Iraqi situation is very similar to the case of the West Balkan, because all the ethnic and the sectarian group they insist their own truths, and they compete each other for the who are more victimized, or who are more sufferers. So when the question came through, he talked about the state level and the politician level, policy makers level, and she talked about the NGO level. And my question is, what about the people's the popular level, or maybe we can say that daily life. How can the people, or the people in the daily life, can construct the kind of the notion of the common understanding? And it may relate to the literature, or may relate to the symbol, or like a monument that yesterday we talked about the role of the monument, and also I can say rewriting history, or how about the role of the intellectuals also towards the popular level? Thank you.
So it's all from me, right? Thank you. Yeah. First I will answer, not one question, but a new comment. One of the lines, you probably saw it, I didn't have time to read all the lines, is that without serious political will, nothing will happen. And it goes without saying. But the additional problem from this perspective is that, it's not that you have like kind of political agents or parties or the ones who rule, without any links with the structural factors, okay? There is a serious, strong structural factors pushing those agents for these kind of narratives. In particular, public opinion, nationalistic idealism, but more than that, I would say the most responsible actors, according to material that I analyze, is church, educational system, and media. They are pushing politicians to do so. And those respond, and then goes vice versa, and you have that perpetuating mechanism of establishing your own truth and insisting, and the louder you are, the bigger patriot you are. And that comes from the ground, if you're, fighting at the ground for your truth, and so on, okay? So this is the kind of problem, okay? So you would really need a serious political leadership, which is strong enough to fight against church. That's not easy, believe me. Not easy in Serbia, not easy in Croatia. For example, they have had one government in Croatia as the government, and they agreed upon some curricula in educational system in one of the projects of mine, which is providing different pictures and different ideas, when it was about to be introduced, church went to the minister, and they get into a conflict, and then minister said, okay, this is going to be like extracurricular. They have that power. You know, you have another situation here in Serbia that, you know, whenever it comes to that Pristina-Belgrade dialogue, speaking about some radical or problematic solution, okay, you have the reaction of the church that Kosovo is Serbia. So you have to fight against, even you have the case here, you know, our president is politically very, very strong. He could be really great agent according to the power structure, okay? But even he would have a problem to fight against church and media, and you know, it doesn't, that's the problem. And on the other hand, really, without strong political will, it doesn't work. And again, we have projects where there is a political will. Huge steps happen very, very easily. Or at least you can see some significant improvement. Regarding your question, we have a problem here regarding NGO. You know, it's like NGO sector here was very, very strong during the 90s and right after the conflict. But in time, I have so many narratives about the NGO sector, and there is kind of new perception and construction of the very NGOization. Okay, first, they are perceived now that they are running for money more than for some goals. After so many years, and well, there must be some truth in there when you see all this documentation, that kind of stuff. Second, you have projects that are financed by some organization, the same project repeating everywhere regardless of the goal of the reality, okay? It's just continuation, repetition. These projects are not relying on, you know, obstacles, real problems of the community and so on. No, it's just repetition, you know, like doing business as usual. And that kind of atmosphere produces negative perception of the NGOs. Another problem is that NGOs are marked by the patriotic structure as traitors. I have a friend in Croatia, Goran Božićić, I mean, who is national traitor. Why? Well, because he was advocating for the Serbian truth. Personally, as you know, it's like ad hominem. You know, they are attacking him personally. You have a wonderful NGO in Croatia called Documenta. They provided lots of evidence about crimes of Croatian forces. And they are publicly exposed as traitors. So see, they are fighting against this patriotic truth. That's not easy. You know, those are their people. They have neighbors. They have sons. And they're traitors of their higher national goals. It's not easy. So NGOs, this is why in fighting for that double truth principle and the achievement of that, you need soft approach. You really need soft approach. And you said, you know, from above, from the ground. All these projects from the ground are much more better and much more functional. I mean, we have evaluation and estimation. For example, Vukovar, which is very, very sensitive place, you know, huge war, huge suffering on both sides, particularly on the Croatian side during the early 90s, okay? They have projects like Serbs and Croats, they are, you know, poet evening, and they have, you know, writing songs and reading songs. And in those songs, you can see this suffering, you can see this, you know, pain. And it is common for both sides, and that makes them closer, but it is from the ground. So these homegrown initiatives are the best. And you know what is ridiculous? That project costs like a couple of thousands of euros a year. And one single meeting of a huge politicians who are doing that for their you know, political marketing, you know, costs for one day, who knows how much. And again, you said something about pain, really trauma, pain. It is something that connects people. But paradoxically, it also divides people. Yeah, you know why? Because there is a perception. If I suffer, I would like to know why. If my son died, he died for that. And I'm proud of that nation state that he died for. You know? It's not always, but it would be to much extent, you know, the justification for the suffering. On the other hand, suffer connects people. On the other hand, it could, you know, be a dividing force. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So time is actually up, but if there is any one very important comment or question. So, yeah, please.
Thank you. I have just a short question for Harriet. Maybe this was very interesting for me because I don't know much about this, but when you show this graph with all these relations between how do you actually make these relations? How do you know that something is influencing literature, like Syrian refugees or migrants are influencing German? Is it some kind of process tracing, or is it seen in a work of the authors? How do you actually know this? There is an influence of that. Thank you.
You mean the slide with the little dots? Yeah, that's actually what the students have to learn. That's something that every researcher has learned of his own, and the best researchers make a secret out of how they get from A to B to C, and so brilliant that everybody is astounded. But that's what the students have to learn. How you can develop a new question out of your first question. And there is an element of an accidental element in it, what you know or what you happen to come across, but you still have to find out how you can incorporate that into your question, or whether you want to change your question by doing that. And I think that's very important to get away from thinking in the box, what we've had for so long, and looking at literature as archives. I think that's one of the reasons why people are not so much interested in reading these long novels anymore, because it's from a time past. And this is, of course, a literature that is much closer. Even if it's literature from the past, it is literature that is connected to our situation in the moment. Thank you.
Okay, so at this point in time, I want to close this panel by thanking all participants and discussants. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, so coffee break.